Hello, good afternoon, and welcome back to another installment of What's the Message? I am your host, Claudia Allen. This is my lovely co-host, my boss, my partner in crime. We do it together, Carmela Monk Crawford. And today we are so excited, so honored to have a special guest in Mr. Orlan Johnson. He is the director for the Public Affairs and Religious Liberty, or PARL, organization within the North American Division of Seventh-day Adventists. And so we are so grateful to have you. If you don't mind, could you maybe just share a little bit more about yourself, about your the things that you do?
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's good to be here, and I'm what I would call a recovering attorney. Practiced for about 25 years, and after about 25 years, the question was, am I going to do this another 25 years or do something different? And it was clear it was time to do something different. So after practicing for about 25 years, started running my own consulting work. And one day got a call from the church. Said, hey, we're thinking about kind of expanding this department. Would you be interested? And I was like, sure. I'd like to talk to the person in that position right now. And they said, well, we don't have anybody. And I was like, oh, well, did you get rid of them recently? And it was like, nah, it's been about 13 years. And I was like, oh, so you haven't filled this spot in 13 years, and now you want me to come do something? They were like, yeah, you got it. So I was like, oh, okay, it's a little different. But and then we kind of came in, had a couple conversations, and I kind of saw what they were doing. It seemed to be perfectly in line with stuff I've done in the past. And so we said, well, let's give it a try. And it's been about 5 years. And so we are really focused on public affairs, religious liberty. We do a lot of work where our tagline is simple. We're just here to make friends before we need friends. We're not here to change the world or try to determine how prophecy's not going to be fulfilled or trying to slow down prophecy. We're just here to make sure that you know the God we serve and that he can also be a good God for you as well. And so we try to go out and connect with a lot of individuals in the public sector and the private sector, just kind of like raising our profile. The Adventist church is not a huge church. People don't understand where we fall in the grand scheme of things. We're only 1.2 million Adventists in the North American division. In North America, you have 8 million Mormons, 12 million Jehovah's Witnesses, 30 million Southern Baptists, 100 million Catholics, and we're 1.2 million. So if you want to make an impact, you got to learn how to really connect with other people, because if you go it alone, you'll get squashed.
Yeah.
So that's basically what we do.
And North America includes not just the United States, but Canada.
Yeah, it includes Canada. And in a strange way, we got a few other little weird things, like it includes Guam.
Yes.
It includes another little island that I think was owned by the French at some point as well, and also Bermuda. So it doesn't include Mexico. So we have a strange configuration.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the North American division.
Okay. Very cool. Well, this particular episode is going to be a really interesting one, considering the fact that yesterday President Donald Trump was just acquitted of both articles of impeachment. And so this particular episode, we really kind of want to talk about evangelicalism and how white evangelicals are really in favor of who Donald Trump is, what he does. And so Carmela is going to help us, get a little bit more context and understanding on just that conversation. What's going on? What are they saying? Let's try to make sense of this.
Oh, okay.
Well, and I don't think I'm well versed enough to know the context, because if you're like me, when I look online or I'm watching the news, my question all the time is, what is happening?
Right.
What is happening? This is just unusual to me, because we were always taught, don't talk about religion and politics in polite company.
Right.
But this is the intersection of where we are right now.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, but that's your job.
Yeah.
And so you know better than us. That's where I want to start. Because even if you're talking about the impeachment, you're talking about the acquittal, if you're talking about campaigns, because we're straight in the middle of this right now.
Right.
Religion and politics are coming together. So how do you do that?
Yeah, and I think the reality is religion and politics has always been together.
Yeah.
And I think we're just now starting to see it in a much more overt way. I mean, even if you go to the Bible and it talks about times that are happening, they usually talk about who was king at that time. In the year of so-and-so, in the year of so-and-so. And really, to me, all that was really doing was trying to give you the political context of how something took place.
Yeah.
I think what we're trying to see now is it's getting so overt, and our country has gotten so partisan in every way that politics, what you eat, who you see, what you watch on TV, you are making a decision whether you're on the left or the right.
Yes.
And even in our church, you just want to go to church and people make comments and immediately they want to know, oh, that means you're conservative, or that means you're a liberal, or that means you're a Democrat, or that means you're a Republican. So we're just more of a microcosm of what society is happening right now. And so one of the things that we try to do, because everything is so partisan, is we try to pick the avenues that we go down. One of the things people ask me all the time, well, Orlan, how come you guys didn't make a statement on this? Or we didn't make a statement on that? Well, every statement that our department makes, half the church is going to be mad.
Okay.
Because half the church feels completely different. And that half of the church thinks that the whole church is dumb. And so, even something, if I go out and say we should not have assault weapons, half the church is going to be mad. Because there's a group that likes having assault weapons and still go to church on Sabbath.
Right.
And if I come out and you start talking about social justice, then another half of the church is going to be uncomfortable.
Right.
So we're trying to pick a spot where we're kind of going down the middle of the road, where we find things where everyone can be connected. And one of the ways that happens easily is with an area like Sabbath accommodations. So when people are realizing that I've got a problem on my job, how do we get protection because I don't want to be working on the Sabbath? No one complains about that. But the PA side of what we do, which is the public affairs side of what we do, is where it starts to get tricky. How do you portray yourself to the public in a way where it can be beneficial to your church? And also, how do you portray it in a way where other members of the church actually recognize who you are? And so the combination of that is a little tricky.
Yeah, and I'm only jumping in here because, there may be people who are in this conversation with us right now. They're watching along and they don't know about the ins and outs of Seventh-day Adventists in particular, but Adventists are a very diverse group.
Absolutely.
And one of the most diverse denominations I understand in the world.
Absolutely.
And so you do have all races, all cultures, nationalities, because Seventh-day Adventists take the Bible seriously when you're talking that revelation to every kindred, tongue, nation, everything. And so that, I don't think, wisely, John didn't say every political party, but that I'm sure that the Lord wants to invite everybody.
Absolutely.
But so when you say this, portraying yourself to the world, I guess I'm asking you to drill down for me as an individual. I'm out there and I'm frustrated because I feel just like in the church, what you're saying, and the people. There are people, just like we saw in Congress, completely split down the middle.
Yes, for sure.
How do we navigate this one-on-one individually? Because other people, Sabbath accommodations for people who are Sabbath keeping, you need to, sometimes you need to ask for your Sabbath off or the Sabbath off so that you could worship and observe according to your conscience. But if we're talking something short of, this is my belief, this is, I'm gonna die on this hill, but just on a day-to-day reaction, I don't like your tone. How are we supposed to deal with that?
Right. Well, I think one of the things that we try to do, in particular, even talking about Sabbath accommodations, it probably is more precise to say we focus on religious accommodations.
Okay.
So not just what happens for Seventh-day Adventists, what happens for Muslims, what happens for anyone. And that's one of the things I think that helps us to be able to navigate that. We still kind of operate from the concept of injustice for one is injustice for all.
Okay.
We're not simply saying that we want to protect somebody on the Sabbath. We want to protect somebody's religious beliefs, no matter what it might be.
Gotcha.
And we've had that reputation from the very beginning. And so that helps us to kind of get through a lot of different circles that you normally wouldn't be in. And so the way we really try to accommodate is it kind of goes back to this tagline. We just want to establish relationships. And as we establish relationships, then they get a better idea of who we are. I mean, most people don't join churches because of the doctrines of the church. They join churches because they like the people at the church. And so if you can kind of portray yourself as being a regular, nice person, that is trying to actually show love more than anything else, then you get more people who are willing to listen to you. So that's why when I say the public affairs side of the business is important, if they have a better idea what kind of person you are, then they may actually care about what your religious beliefs are.
Yeah.
If you just simply try to pound people on your religious beliefs, then they ask that question, who are you and where have you been?
Right.
And so if we can kind of help people understand who we are, what we do, what we've been in the past, then I think it helps them to have a better idea of, oh, you're that group.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, ideally, it would be great if somebody said, Seventh-day Adventists, oh, those are the most loving people in the world.
Yeah.
We're not there yet.
Well, but truthfully, when you look at the news right now, I'm not sure most people think of the reputation of evangelicals as a whole as the most loving right now.
No, I think evangelicals are considered by the public to be kind of, fringe groups that are at the extremes. And that's one of the things why, in particular, from our department standpoint, we don't wrap ourselves into the title of being evangelical. We just try to wrap ourselves in the title of being a religious group that wants to make sure that no one does anything to infringe upon our religious beliefs. And that's why I think it's been really tough, because the leadership in politics, they want those groups to be political when they think those groups can be helpful. But if they don't think that group can be helpful, then it flips the other way, where we don't want you to have a voice. Which is kind of, and we talked a little bit about the whole Johnson Amendment.
Yeah.
The Johnson Amendment, which basically says that churches should not be involved in partisan politics or even involved in politics in general, really got started in 1954 because a religious group was really aggressively against Lyndon Johnson running for office. And when he saw how aggressive they were, he was a very powerful senator. He went back and said, I'm putting something in the code that says if you're a religious group and you get that aggressive, we're going to strip you of being nonprofit. And so it became the Johnson Amendment.
Which would mean you would have to pay taxes like everybody, other organizations.
You had to be treated just like everybody else. So even that amendment came into play pursuant to pure politics. And the idea, and I've always had the thought, whenever you create some type of law or legislation that's really trying to take care of one thing for somebody's personal issue, it's generally going to be bad legislation. And so although the Johnson Amendment is something we can work through, to be honest, I'm not for it or against it.
Okay.
And the reason is if you're for it, then that means you're okay that government came in and stifled you.
Right.
If you're against it, which means then they're going to have to police you in a way where you have to open up your books and records to see if you are violating. I don't want any of that to happen.
Okay.
So right now, the federal government can't come in and say, I'd like to see your numbers on tithe and offering. I'd like to see what you did from an expense standpoint. But if you start to tinker with the Johnson Amendment, because a lot of the changes have been, well, allow churches only to go up to a certain percentage of activity. Well, then the question is, well, how are you going to know they're not violating that percentage? Well, I got to see your checkbook. Where did you send your money? Who did you have come visit you? I can't open that door either. So it's a bad play either way. And that's why in many instances, we try to stay neutral on it. But if you're coming in and want to do something more aggressive, then that's when we'll come in and say, we just can't support this next thing.
So this is my thing, right? Because I hear that. And so it makes me wonder, are there churches or faith communities who are either afraid of the Johnson Amendment? So they're saying, hey, we're not going to have anything to do with politics. We don't want to make a stand or a statement on anything regarding, gun control or police brutality or, anything whatsoever. We're just going to have this kind of standoffish mentality because we don't want to potentially get that Johnson Amendment slap on the wrist. Or, is there also the reality that now the church is no longer having, its moral voice in the world, and that, no longer is it speaking out against some of the what we might consider to be immoral stances or legislation that might be coming, whether that be within local government or federal government.
Got it. Well, the Johnson Amendment kind of gives you a little bit of a carve-out that if you are engaging in those type of social issues that generally feel like they're political issues, as long as you're not engaging in a partisan way, you're okay. In other words, you can't just have the Democrats come into your church and talk. You got to have everybody come in. You have to make it open. Now, maybe only the Democrats will come, But as long as you're able to demonstrate, we just sent an open invitation to everybody to come in and talk on this issue, then you're not going to be in violation.
Got you.
So the key is engaging in activity that doesn't really support a left agenda or a right agenda, but it's just an agenda that makes sense, like voter registration or,
Got you.
Even talking about moral issues that you think are in the best interest of the country. The interesting thing is you have some political parties that decide to start saying, well, we're the party of the moralities.
Yes, talk about that.
And that party is not moral. And then when they start connecting with people whose morality are clearly off the chain, then they start saying, but we still want to forgive people. So
right.
It still kind of boils down to when the agenda works for you, you kind of decide how you're going to blend your politics in to support what you really want to see happening.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a time if you were married more than once, you could never be president of the United States.
Absolutely.
There was a time that if your moral compass was even slightly off, you didn't even dream about running.
Yeah.
That's no longer the case.
Absolutely.
And and the evangelicals don't talk about it anymore. I mean, there was a time where it was all about morals to be their candidate.
Yeah, absolutely.
And now, you have evangelical for Trumps that if you ask them about that, they said, well, we cringe at certain things that we hear, but we still think none of us are perfect and forgiveness is still at the top of the, so you've got a nice dialogue to support whatever you really want to see happening.
This has my head spinning because, while you're talking about this, I'm thinking of the headlines where President Trump is rallying, saying to people, God is on our side.
Right.
You have his faith-based leader, Paula White, saying that, if you're not for Donald Trump in this administration, then they're equating that to, you're not on the Lord's side and you're going to hell.
Right.
That kind of thing.
Absolutely.
So, and so this is a very uncomfortable, I haven't heard the fever pitch like this in a long time.
Yeah.
Let me put it that way. And so
it's a scary conflation of church and state in ways that we have not seen in American politics in very long time.
Yeah.
Well, and I guess that's a good question. Does this rhetoric bother you, or do you see the rhetoric that conflates church and state going to a deeper level that would implicate the kind of work that you do around religious freedom?
Yeah, what I look at is I just view this as another step in prophecy.
Okay.
The idea of at some point there will be a time in this country that we call the land of the free, that the government will come in and oppress all religious people, take away these rights that we believe are sacrosanct to us. Is it going to happen? And so this combination of what we see with conversations relating to church and state, I just view that as another step towards prophecy. So on one hand, it's disturbing, but on the other hand, I've already been to the back of the book. I kind of know where this ends. So I'm not shocked by it, but what we try to do is to inform people to understand what's going on. I mean, I think sometimes Christians think that there's going to be some one big event that's going to happen to say, oh, that's it. We're now coming to the end. I think it's actually a death by 1,000 paper cuts.
Yeah.
It's the little things that have been
yeah.
happening. It's the small things that they chip away at. And then one day you wake up and you realize that, it's already gone. People call me and say, hey, I just heard that there's going to be Sunday blue laws. And I'm like, well, no, the Sunday blue laws have been in place for like 50 years.
Absolutely.
They're just not enforcing them.
Correct.
I mean, take the Johnson Amendment, for example. There has been no case that's ever gone to court based on somebody violating the Johnson Amendment. Never.
Oh, wow.
And most people believe it will never happen.
Why are people saying that they want to get rid of it or repeal it when there's no cases that are coming through?
There you go. So I think that's a perfect rhetoric that someone is using as a political tool to try to demonstrate that they're actually doing something to help you, when in reality, they're doing nothing.
Wow.
It sounds good. When you're somebody who just likes what I call reality TV.
You're not mentioning names, but
No,
we
I
all
didn't
know who
mention
you're talking
any names,
about.
but you're more into what sounds good than the reality. I mean, when the president was talking about what he was going to be doing with the Johnson Amendment, the one thing I kept thinking to myself, but everything he said hasn't changed anything. I think the evangelical groups are starting to realize now that all of that chatter really hasn't changed anything. And the question is, how are they going to respond? They're probably not going to respond by voting for the left, but they'll probably respond by staying home. And in my experience of looking at presidential politics, and this is where I think the current president's going to have a tough time, you can't win your next election by only having what you had the first time around. If Barack Obama didn't get more votes in Ohio the second time around than the first time around, he'd have lost Ohio and maybe lost the presidency. So if you're actually not building a coalition to increase in some way, I think you're actually dying. And no matter what the rhetoric is around, if a small percentage of evangelicals stays home, he loses.
Wow.
And I think that's why he's trying to pump up these evangelicals for Trump, not necessarily because he's looking for a bigger group. He's just hoping to hold the same group.
To hold on to that.
That now has looked at his record to say, what have we actually really gotten from this guy, And when you really sit down and start analyzing it, you may come to the conclusion, I really haven't gotten a lot.
That's interesting that you say that, because a few weeks ago, back in January 2020, we saw a story about prayer in schools. And when I went to read the document, I believe it was on the State Department website or something like that. And no, it wasn't. It was the Attorney General. And everything that he said was basically, this is just to let you know, nothing has changed. Each student may pray, as you and I, all of us did pray before we went into our tests and everything like this. A season of prayer when we were in the bar, right? And all that sort of thing.
Absolutely.
And so everybody can do that. Students are allowed to have prayer, so that was offered and it was dangled there, and the fact that it was announced in front of the public was something that was meant to energize evangelicals, but those rights have always been there.
Absolutely. And that's why, a lot of this, if you really aren't focused on what you're hearing, you get totally confused. And, and even in the practice of law sometimes, the reason you want a jury is because you're figuring it'll be more confusing. If you just wanted the law to the right decision to be, you'd go in there with a judge who understands the law and let the judge tell you what goes down. The reason you want a jury in there because you want 12 folk who potentially can be confused. And that is exactly what's happening in politics.
Somebody who's going to give you the benefit of the doubt. I don't think this applies. Whatever.
Just a little bit off. Say, I don't like that.
I
don't care what the law said. I'm uncomfortable with that.
Right.
That's what you're hoping for.
So we're working with folks who are, through their own bias or their own filter, willing to really cast their lot with somebody who speaks a good game, or a system that speaks a good game, is what I'm hearing you say. So there are people. No, let me back up. I don't like when people say there are people. It's so general. Even within our history as Seventh-day Adventists, in my history, your history, there was a time where people didn't believe that you should vote or that you should be active because, and this still stands today, one, you can't know what people are going to do.
Right.
And you don't want to cast your future, the future of our communities, with someone who's going to take us down a road that's going to curtail liberties and freedoms, right?
Right.
And two, you don't know somebody's their heart.
Right.
These things are always there. Where do you come in, and that when you look at something like that in terms of voting, when you think about in terms of advocacy on policies and things like that?
I'm a firm believer that you're supposed to be active in everything that's going on. Politics, community activities. And if I go back to the Bible and I think about Daniel, I think about Joseph, part of the reason that the Israelites, to some degree, were even protected was because they had people in leadership positions.
For sure.
Esther. Yeah, Esther as well. Daniel must have been so good, he crossed over administration.
Yes, he did.
He went from one king to another king, a whole nother kingdom.
Yeah.
So
and after
to
a
me,
coup, an overthrow.
right.
He was good.
An entire coup. His
Everybody was out except him.
Yeah, absolutely.
So to me, I think actually the public needs our voice. There are people who think, well, we don't want to be involved because, in my opinion, they're too afraid that the system will change them as opposed to believing that we're actually strong enough that we can go in and change the system. And I think this idea that we can't be involved in politics because politics will just taint us, I think it's just a bad construct. I think you really need to be in politics. And I believe that I'd like to see more Adventists, not just on one party. I think we need to be involved on both sides of the aisle. And, when I was involved in the Obama administration's, I worked with Barack Obama when he was running for president. First time I'd ever been involved in a presidential campaign. And I was on the National Finance Committee, and I used to travel around and just see a lot of stuff. And I remember one day I was getting ready to eat lunch, and there was a whole bunch of us. And somebody looked at me, and they said, "Hey, Orlan, that stuff you normally eat, it's on page 3." And I was like, What is that? What is I was thinking, oh, we're about to go here. And then, but I realized they had been watching what I eat. And they understood that for some reason there were certain foods I didn't eat and certain things I didn't drink. And I didn't even realize they were watching me.
Yeah.
And they made that statement to basically say, oh, yeah, we've been watching you and we know you're not eating what's on page 7. And to me, it became almost a testimony as to who I was.
Yeah.
And then eventually somebody would ask me, why don't you eat that? And I'd be like, well, Leviticus says, what's Leviticus?
What is Leviticus?
Yeah, that's in the Bible. What's the Bible? So it's like, it gives you an opportunity to impact people. And to me, I think how can you be salt if you're in the salt shaker?
Yeah.
You got to get out and mix with people, let them feel you and understand who you are. And hopefully you're strong enough in your beliefs to make an impact. So I'm completely the opposite. I believe that we're supposed to be in everything we can be in. Politics. I mean, when I was growing up, they didn't tell you Adventists shouldn't even be lawyers. Because,
I didn't.
Lawyers are just liars. And, they're just going to go and lie for people. And Christians shouldn't do that. Get a nice profession like a doctor where you can
or a teacher.
Or a teacher where you can teach folk. But don't be a lawyer because you have to go in court and lie for your client who's probably a crook and should be in jail. And,
Guilty.
Yeah, guilty. They're all guilty.
That's crazy.
So society, I think, is getting it a little bit more. But, we're moving from place to place with this. But I'm a firm believer you got to be in everything. I don't think there's a space that Adventists or other Christians shouldn't be in.
Yeah,
That's just my own.
At the end of the day, politics is made up of people.
Yeah.
And so regardless of, whatever your race or gender or religious affiliation, you should be participating in whatever the, legislative makeup
Absolutely
is, for your community, and for
no question about it.
If you're not participating in it, I personally have a strong feeling that you are at that point kind of taking advantage of the system because you want the system to work for you.
Right.
You don't want it to take advantage of you, yet you do not want to do any of the work to kind of ensure, protect, secure any of those rights and liberties. And so, I know some of the Adventists are particularly conservative when dealing and engaging with politics, but I know other religions are also, similarly disengaged. And so it's just kind of a admonition, I feel like, that, and even as I'm thinking about this, Mitt Romney's comments yesterday, I feel like really even speak to this because as a Mormon, he even mentioned in his speech, like, hey, my conscience is disturbed with how we have handled these proceedings. And my faith is compelling me to do or not do a certain way. And so he's literally become the first, Republican to cross over in an impeachment vote. And so I think that at some level, we all have to say, whatever my sphere of influence is, am I willing to put my faith and my belief system above whatever the political or civic agenda is? And I think that that's what we're not seeing with the evangelicals for Trump. It's like whether they are evangelical pastors or whether they are other congressmen or senators within the administration, it appears as though there is kind of this like leaving behind of certain moral values and principles that the party particularly held on to
Right.
as instead of, or for the purpose of just kind of maintaining the sanctity of the party itself. And
Right.
it's like, I just feel like, you're in a real dangerous situation when everyone is willing to just sacrifice their morals, their values, and their principles, just so that the party can be right.
Well, the other thing that's happening is people are becoming what I would call single agenda supporters.
Okay.
In other words, you really don't believe in everything, but you think this guy will allow you to get the Supreme Court justices you want. So you're willing to basically hold your nose and deal with anything else that happens as a result of it. And that is what is happening in a lot of cases. To be honest, if most of the Republican senators really felt comfortable in just voting what they really believe, Donald Trump probably would have been found guilty.
Absolutely.
But so many of them are concerned with what the political ramifications would be about making a certain vote. A guy like Mitt Romney's view is, the president can't touch me. The people who support me are so rock solid. He can come to Utah and say anything he wants, and when it's all said and done, I'm still going to be back here. Most of the other people in that chamber don't feel that way. And I think if they felt that they didn't have any leverage to deal with, I don't know if they would have got 2/3 vote, but he probably would have got a lot more on the other side just based off of who people really believe they are. The other irony is about church is that when I started working on campaigns, I felt that real politics was less political than church politics.
Oh,
Really?
Yeah.
And he said that.
I mean,
Wait,
I
I should do
just
like Nancy Pelosi.
yeah, I mean,
Goodness.
I mean, folk were like saying, "Hey, Orlan, you ever done this before?" And I was like, "Nah," and they were like, "You real comfortable with this?" I was like, "Bro, this is
You ain't seen
this
nothing.
is child's play from where I come from."
play.
I mean,
Amateur.
yeah, stuff I've seen. I was
Yeah.
like, "Oh, this is all we gonna do here?" Oh, nah.
That's all y'all bring.
That's all y'all got here? Oh, boy. Y'all need to come to one of my church business meetings.
That's terrible. That's terrible.
Yeah, that's the reality. I mean, I was just like, this ain't that bad. I see
No.
worse than this.
Yeah.
My mother worked for the church. I saw way more politics.
Yeah.
We like nice here, actually.
Absolutely, yeah. I've gone to
So-
a couple, what is it, executive committee meetings,
Yeah.
because my mom had to go there,
Oh,
and
no.
so my brother and I would just sit on the wall, just like,
It's rugged in there.
it's much more terrifying than the
Oh,
Senate
yeah.
floor.
Oh, yeah.
Let's just say
Yeah.
that.
At least you had a sergeant in arms or
Right.
two
Yeah.
and some
Yeah.
Capitol's police and security.
Yeah.
to take some
Right.
stuff
Yeah.
For
Yeah,
people
so-
who slipped in stuff.
Right.
Right.
So for me, it was like I was pretty okay.
Yeah.
And even my first time through, I was like, oh, okay, this ain't that bad.
Well,
We
my
actually
question-
got some rules here
Yeah.
that we abide by.
You said a few minutes ago, that you thought, that all Christians should be engaged and in essence be salt outside the shaker. But I'm gonna be real here right
Yeah.
now, and you all are dancing around this, but I am uncomfortable with too many Christians right now in the mix. They need to get back in the shaker,
Right.
as far as I'm concerned.
Okay.
Because now,
It's too salty.
It's too salty.
Right.
People
It's too salty.
people want. I get emails all the time. We need to all join in on the boycott against Target because they have the open dressing rooms so that anybody can go in, right? I don't like that. I'm just saying the perception of a Christian being so overly involved in everybody's personal choice
Right.
I see what you're
this
saying.
is a bad situation for me.
Yeah.
So you're saying that it's almost to the point where people are actually legislating their faith, their individual faith beliefs.
Yeah, my personal beliefs now must be your beliefs. And
Right.
if you don't agree with that, then you're not on God's side.
Right.
And I'm perfectly within my right to demean and demoralize you, to
Yeah.
talk about you, or whatever. And so, for me, I feel as though we are dangerously at this point where a certain group can define what it means to be moral, what
Yeah.
it means to be religious.
Right.
And so I'm wondering whether in your work or in your personal interaction with people, what would you say would be the proper rules of engagement?
Right.
Okay, if you want to influence, but here's a line that I don't think should be crossed. That's what
Right.
I'm asking.
You know, I think Americans generally don't believe in lines. And I think if you
Okay.
let them in the room, then, you know, that's democracy on full display. And I think if you let them in the room and you try to limit how far they can go, then you'll get the cry that we're becoming more socialist or communist or something along those lines. So I think in my mind, the rules of engagement really become people need to be informed to understand what's really going on. And then when you go out and vote, you will be making a vote to hopefully have society be more in line with what you're comfortable with. Because what happens is, I mean, listen, religion has been an issue from the beginning of time. I mean, more wars were fought over religion than anything else. I mean, you know, Henry VIII wants to get a divorce. Catholic Church not down. He's like, all right, now I'm creating the Church of England.
I make my own church.
Right, I make my own church.
Absolutely.
And part of what's happening is we have people who are every day trying to just make their own church. And their church changes based on what's going on every day. And so I think the rules of engagement are really understanding that there are no rules. That when you get into the arena, you have to have your own helmet on to protect yourself because government and society and even church aren't really protected. I mean, think about some of the things that government's got involved in. The reason that government really has got involved in things like divorce and things of that nature is because the church was handling it in a terrible way. You know, you had women who were basically being disenfranchised and they were being treated that way in the name of Jesus. So then the government has to come and say, whoa, 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 whoa. We can't have that happening in the name of religion. So now we're going to impose some rules. And so what ends up happening is when the church doesn't control itself or really stand out to kind of take on the moral agenda that it claims it wants to. If it's not done in a way where society is comfortable, then that just gives the government the right to step in. And I think the rule of engagement really is how do we live a life where we're treating people in a way where nobody has to come in and really, you know, chastise us for not doing the right thing. And as a church, not us, our church, many churches have just not been willing to do the right thing.
I agree with that, but I feel like it's almost like a rebuttal to what you're talking about in the sense that now the church is trying to control the government. So that's like now you have the church saying, oh, well, the government is not acting morally or the government is not doing X, Y, Z the way we want it to, or the government, blah, 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 blah. So now we need to reimpose our own level of control on legislation. So, you know, we have all of the conversation around pro-life, pro-choice, the entire conversation around even non-gender-based bathrooms. You know, like there are just a number of things that I think some would maybe identify as being a leftist politics, that the right is kind of very intentional about saying, well, this is a moral conversation, an immoral conversation, and so it needs to be legislated accordingly. And the others are saying this is a freedom of choice conversation, a will conversation, and so it's this like I'm just noticing like this crazy tension right now in trying to figure out what is appropriate for the government to legislate and what is inappropriate for them to legislate. Because if we legislate to take away the free rights of one, then you can immediately legislate to take my free rights.
Oh, absolutely.
And so it just gets really complicated in terms of figuring out. And then on top of that, it's like, oh, well, the Bible says X, Y, Z, right? But it's like, while the Bible is a text, the Bible still has to be interpreted, and the Bible also still has to be applied. And so it's like, how then, what is the interpretation of this particular scripture that we're putting into legislation? How are we going to enforce or apply this particular belief system or principle? And so it's like things get really muddy when you have hosts of evangelicals who are backing a president that is vulgar, that has 3 wives, that, you know, there's evidence of his engagement in prostitution. Like there is evidence that he has, you know, I guess he was acquitted of it, but there is evidence that he has conspired with foreign countries and foreign governments, right? And so it's like there's like a list of things that, on the one hand we can say, oh, well, there's scripture for this, and then, a few years ago, Jeff Sessions wanted to come out and quote Romans. So it's like, the text is open enough to accommodate to whichever side for whatever agenda. And I think that's what's so scary and so dangerous about being in a time when Donald Trump can say being for Trump is being on God's side.
Right.
Because in the same way that he could use scripture to support whatever he's doing, I can use scripture to oppose everything that he's doing and support everything that, maybe more liberal agendas are fighting for.
Right. Well, I think the sad thing is the church in general is no longer a valid moral compass.
Yeah.
And I think once the church cannot claim that title anymore, then the government now feels they have to come in and try to legislate morality. And once a government is starting to legislate morality, all bets are off. You have no idea what you're going to get out of it because the government is just, depending on what concentric circle of people that you're around at any given point in time. And we've got 50 states and a lot of different things. So the sad thing is we are not in a position where anybody gets to claim the high road anymore. And when that's not the case, then everybody claims the high road. When you think about some of the things that Donald Trump has said and what he does, on one hand, he's supposed to be, appointed by God, but on the other hand, he'll say, I could probably go out and Broadway and shoot people dead and it wouldn't matter.
Yeah.
You'd still vote for me. I mean, so it's such a conflicting statement that that's more of a reason why we have to keep people informed so that they don't get confused, because these things are just meant to confuse people and not let them really have a clear understanding of what they should do. And then they go into election polls and they just check the first name at the top of the box and just go home. They just, and that's what a lot of politicians would like. They'd like for you not to really understand what's going on. That you go in the room and you're like, I think I've heard that name before, and that's the box you check. I mean, my sons told me one time they went to vote and they saw their grandmother's name in front of somebody and they voted for that person. And I was like, do you even know who they were? They were like, no, I said Joycelyn. That's grandma's name. How bad could it be? I mean,
no.
Yeah, it's just, but that's the concept that people think it's not that big a deal. The scary thing for me is now being president of the United States, I think is viewed as not being a serious job. That it doesn't matter who's president, if it's just somebody you like. I mean, there was a time you wanted somebody who had some knowledge, had some gravitas,
policy,
understood how serious this was. Getting us in and out of wars is actually important. Who we kill makes a difference,
It makes a difference.
But we're not in that role anymore.
One thing about you that I'm observing that's kind of, it's funny to me, but maybe that's why you have the position that you have. You seem very calm.
Yeah.
You seem very, because right now, the day after the acquittal of the impeachment of Donald Trump and just listening to all this, I am not calm. I am very frustrated. And there's, I watched the vote for vote as they did the roll call. I watched it. I could feel my blood pressure going up because, we're invested in this.
Yes.
So what is that? You know who else is calm like this?
Who?
Chaplain Barry Black.
Oh, okay.
When I've talked to him before, we interviewed him for Message. We saw him at an event, the Conscience and Justice Council last year. And one thing about him is a Senate chaplain. Everybody should know that by now, I guess. The Senate
he
chaplain.
should be famous now.
And he was praying all the way through. And I was praying for him because I was, in my mind and in my imagination, I imagine some senator coming to his office at night like Nicodemus went to Jesus. Just, this is what I want to do. And I don't know if I could use some prayer, And I was hoping there's going to be at least 5 of them, right?
At least 5 came in out of his door.
Anyway, but, so he has that same bearing. What's behind that?
It's probably just my just normal temperament. And also really the idea that I'm not surprised where this is going. I mean, I didn't have to sit and watch the vote count because all that would do is kind of justify what I knew what was happening. I mean, even before the trial started, everybody kind of knew what the vote was going to be. I mean, the only shock was maybe Mitt Romney, but, so for me, I'm kind of not into the minutia of the day-to-day stuff. My thing is, how do we stay focused on demonstrating who we are? And, and if we can demonstrate to be a church of love and an organization of love and an organization where I may not agree with all your principles, but I don't feel that people should be disenfranchised in any way. I mean, I tell people, I understand clearly what our doctrines are as it relates to homosexuality and same-sex marriage, but I don't want to go out and have people, lose their jobs because of that.
Right.
I mean, 29 states in the United States, you can be fired simply because you're gay.
Yeah.
Well, if somebody asks me, is that right? I'm going to say, no, that's not right. But that doesn't mean all of a sudden that I'm expecting to have a gay pastor in the Seventh-day Adventist Church next week. So I think there is a middle ground where you can be truly demonstrating love, but it doesn't mean that your moral compass has shifted. And I think that's part of the issue. I get along pretty well with folk because I am who I am. I'm not coming in pointing fingers. This isn't about judgment. This is about, hey, what can we find out where we all agree?
I think that's a really perfect takeaway. That's a perfect way to end. And
Awesome.
just encourage all of you as we continue to be civically, socially engaged, that we be informed and that we come at it from a place of education and love. That's all we can do, right?
That's it.
Make sure that you are following us at Message1898 on Instagram, Twitter. Catch us on Facebook. You can watch this episode on Facebook Watch. Also, make sure that you are subscribed to our print issue of the magazine. Go to www.messagemagazine.com. You do not want to miss a lot of the art, a lot of the articles, a lot of the stuff, the recipes, all kinds of material that we put in our print issue that is not available online. So make sure you are getting our weekly newsletters online. Make sure you're on our social media, but make sure you are getting your print issue as well. This has been What's the Message with Claudia, Carmela, and Mr. Orlan Johnson. We will catch you next time.
Thank you.
See you later.